Welcome to Planet's self-help video on the topic of the Connections Manager. One of the biggest changes in Cabinet Vision version 12 is the addition of connections. A connection is a group of operations that can be applied to the joints of your assemblies. There are two steps required to use these new connections within your assemblies. The first is to create the connections within the Connection Manager. The second is to apply these connections to the various joints of your cabinets by choosing them from within the Assembly Manager. We will firstly look to our splash screen where we can see we have a button called Connections. If we click this, we are presented with the Connections Manager. Here we can see a list of all the connections we currently have available to us. These are listed by type, ID, name, and description. You can click on any of these headings to sort by that type. For instance, clicking the Name heading will sort all of your connections by name to make it easier to find what you're looking for. Above the list of connections, in the ribbon bar, we have the standard options for creating new connections, copying existing connections, and deleting connections. You can also modify any selected connection by clicking the Modify button. We will start by clicking New to create a new connection. Here you can give your connection a name and description, as well as choose the type of connection you require. From the drop-down list, we can see that we have several options for the type of connection. By selecting the type from the drop-down box, you will see it gives you a visual representation of the type of connection you will create. Boring is used for simple drilling operations into the face or ends of parts, carcass screws or conformats or dowels, for example. The connector type allows you to use any of the connectors you have set up within your Material Manager. Some standard connectors include cam fittings such as Rafix or Caberneos, several of the lamello fittings, as well as fasten link or lockdowel fittings. Customers with Solid Ultimate can also create their own custom connectors. The dado option allows for a full rebate, such as a 3mm rebated back panel. Dovetail can be used to create dovetail joints for timber parts. IntelliJoints can also be set up within a new connection. This allows you to apply an existing IntelliJoint as a connection automatically via the Assembly Manager. Line bore is used to create repeat borings for adjustable shelf fittings. Mortise and Tenon will create a Mortise and Tenon joint. And the final option, Set, allows you to add one or more of the previous connections into a connection set, so they are always used together. For example, you can add a screw operation and a Rafix connector to a single set, or a Mortise and Tenon operation alongside a Caberneo connector. For our first example, we're going to start by creating a simple screw connection. To do this, we will select the type Boring from the Type drop-down. When naming your connections, it is advisable to define a clear naming structure, as you may be creating numerous connections for different hardware or operations, so naming them accurately will help you easily select the connection you need later. We will call this connector Carcass 3mm diameter 50mm inset. You can expand upon this further in the description if required. I'm going to assume we do not have a machine capable of horizontal drilling, so we will leave the master hole diameter at 0. The master hole depth will also be 0. The slave holes will be drilled into the face of the adjacent part, so we will set this to 3mm. We want our holes to be drilled through the part, so we'll leave this option on Through hole. I want my drilling centered on the part, so we'll leave center on thickness selected. We will also leave center on mitered parts selected. As we will not be using a fixed head horizontal boring machine, we will leave this setting on No. Now we can specify how we want to position our holes. We will choose front and rear holes. The number of front holes will be 1, and we will set this hole at 50mm back from the front edge. The number of rear holes will also be 1, and we will also set the hole in 50mm from the rear. Now we can set the maximum spacing between holes. For example, if we are using this connection where a deck meets a carcass end, and we want 3 drillings for a standard 560 end, setting a spacing of 300mm will ensure we get 3 holes where the panel is between 400 and 700mm. With this, we have completed the wizard and can select Finish. We now have a new connection that can be applied to our assembly construction. Once you have created one connection, it is simple to copy this and create variations for different size components. This is easily done by selecting the previous connection and pressing Copy from the ribbon bar. We can then rename the connection. We will call this Carcass 3mm diameter 2 times 20mm inset, and hit OK. With this done, we have a new connection that we can now edit using the Modify button in the ribbon bar. As this connection is very similar to the original connection, we only have to change a few values to create this new connection. Here we will change our front inset to 20mm and also our back inset to 20mm. If we were to use this connection on a small part, we may not want any more than the 2 front and back holes. Instead of maximum spacing, we can change the number of holes to 0. This will prevent the connection from adding additional holes as the part size increases. With these settings changed, we can hit Finish. We now have created another connection that would be suitable to apply to small parts such as stretchers or drill box components. Another common operation type is the line bore operation to drill for our adjustable shelf holes. To create a connection for these, we can click on New Connection, and we will choose the type line bore from the type drop-down. We will name this connection line bore, 5 by 5mm diameter, 1mm gap. The line bore connection will control the clearance between the adjustable shelf and the carcass. We will set this to 1mm. We are given the choice of bore required, which will bore the number of holes per shelf that we specify, or we can use case holes, which will fill the assembly with a run of holes from top to bottom. We will leave this setting on bore required. We're going to set the quantity of holes to 5, the diameter to 5mm, and the depth to 12mm. We're going to leave the position of our holes set to front and rear, as we want our adjustable holes to be set in a specified distance from the front and rear of the shelf. We will set our front position to 50mm, and our back position to 50mm. Once my part becomes larger, I may require additional shelf holes in the center of the shelf to support the extra weight. By adding a spacing, I can control whether another row of holes will be added. I will set the maximum spacing to 800mm. We can now specify the centers between our line bores. I want to utilize my CNC's multi-drilling head, so I will set this to 32mm. This completes the wizard, so we will click Finish. Now we will create 2 additional connections that can be used on assemblies where you do not wish to see screw fixings or you need additional strength. first of these connections will be for a Cabineo cam fitting. This will require a Cabineo connector to be present in your Material Manager. If you have a fresh install of Cabinet Vision version 12, the Cabineo will already be in your Material Manager. If you do not have this in your system, you can easily create it by navigating to your Material Manager, selecting the Connectors folder, and clicking the New Material button from the ribbon bar. For the type, we will select Connector. We will give our connector a name. This will be named Cabineo 12. You can also enter a description if you wish. You can then set the unit of issue. This should remain on each to ensure we are counting each connector as a separate item. The type we will set to be the Cabineo 12. We will leave our finishes and textures as defaults for now. You can change the finish and texture of the fitting at any time from the Material Manager. Now that we have a Cabineo connector created, we can create the connection for it within the Connections Manager. To do this, we will click on Connections and then click New. We're going to change the type to Connector. We can give it a name and description. I will name this one Connector Cabineo 12 2 times 50mm inset. We can now choose the connector we want to use within the connection. Clicking on the grey button will take us to the Material Manager, where we can navigate to our Connectors folder and choose the Cabineo 12 connector and click OK. The settings for this connection will be similar to the screws we created earlier, so we will skip through to the position of our connectors, which will be front and rear as before, with one connector at the front with a position of 80mm and one connector at the rear with a position of 80mm. I'm going to use the Cabineos for some added strength, but also to locate my part. I'm going to change from using max spacing to use a specific number of connectors, and we will enter 0. We can now finish. Another good option for strengthening a joint, or to use on parts where you don't want to see fittings, is a Mortise and Tenon joint. To create this, we will click New from the ribbon bar, and we will now choose a Mortise and Tenon for the type of connection. I will name this one M&T 6mm deep 2 times 80mm tab. The depth of the tenon will be 6mm. The pocket width across the tenon should be the diameter of the downshear tool you plan to use. We will be using an 8mm tool, so I will set this to 8mm. We do not want to suppress the dado extension, as this allows the mortise to be longer than the tenon by the tool diameter. So we will leave this option as no. We want our tenon to be approximately 8mm wide, so I'll set the distance down to the top of the tenon to 8mm. My bottom shoulder will be flush with the part, so we will set this to 0. My shoulder widths will be 50mm for the front, and 50mm for the back. We need a small adjustment for the width of the mortise, which I will set to 0.3 millimeters. We also need an adjustment for the length, which I will set to 1 millimeter, and a depth adjustment for the mortise cut, which I will set to 0.5 millimeters. This completes the questions for the mortise and tenon, so we will finish. Lastly, we will combine two of these connections together to demonstrate how connection sets can be created. Again, we will create a new connection. This time we will set the type to set. We will give the connection a name of set, screw 3 millimeters diameter, 50 millimeter inset, cabaneo 2 times 80 millimeters. When creating sets of connections, all we need to do is select the required connection from the left and click Add, and do this for each of the connections we need within the set. With the two connections added, we can click Finish. We now have 6 different connections available to us to use within the Assembly Manager. To do this, we need to navigate back to our splash screen and click on Assembly. Check that you have Assembly selected from the top drop-down menu, and then select your standard construction method from the bottom drop-down menu. We don't want to apply our new connections to our standard method at this time, so we will copy this construction method and we will name it Connection Manager Example. You will notice from within the tree on the left of the window we have Interior Case, Exterior Case, Operations, and now, new to version 12, Connection. In previous versions you could access all questions related to a specific part by navigating to the Interior or Exterior Case group and then modifying the part from within that group. Now in version 12, questions related to how the part meets other parts in the assembly are no longer within the interior and exterior case groups, but have been separated into the connection group. We will now apply each of the created connections to various parts within the cabinet. Firstly, we double-click the top to modify its properties. The first question controls how the top and finished ends connect. The drop-down menu shows the type of joint these parts will have. This is currently correct, so I will move on to the connection. You will see that we can specify different connections for a top or a top stretcher. If we use a full top in our assembly, we will use the set we created containing the 3mm screw holes and cabaneo connectors. For this example, we will not set any connection on the top stretcher, but another connection could be created for this. We can then move through to the question about how our top and unfinished ends connect. Here for the top, we can use the carcass 3mm diameter, 15mm inset connection, and for the top stretcher, we will use the carcass 3mm diameter 2 by 20mm inset connection. We can then finish the wizard. The process is the same for applying connections to the deck. Double-click on the deck from the connection group, and then for our deck to finished end question, I will select the connector, cabaneo 2 times 80mm inset. We will then move through to the deck and unfinished end question, and I will select the same carcass connection I used for the top to unfinished end. To add our line boring, we will double click on the adjustable shelf. For our adjustable shelf to finished end, we will choose the line bore 5 by 5mm diameter 1mm gap connection. and we will choose the same option for our adjustable shelf to unfinished end. Lastly, we will add our Mortise and Tenon connection to the fixed shelf. We will double click on the fixed shelf, and for the fixed shelf to finished end question, we will select our Mortise and Tenon 80mm tabs times 2 6mm deep connection, and where it meets our unfinished end, we will select our standard 3mm carcass drilling. With this completed, we will finish. We are done adding our connections, so we will now select OK and save our construction method. We will now open a sample job where I have two cabinets already created to show the connections we have applied. Once the job opens, we will need to open the job properties and change the construction method to the Connection Manager example method we just created. Our first cabinet has two unfinished ends, a top stretcher and an adjustable shelf. You can see that our carcass drilling connections have been applied to the deck and to the top stretcher. You can also see that the adjustable shelf has the 5x5mm line boards we specified. The second cabinet has a full top and one of the ends is finished. It also has a fixed shelf. You can see that our connection set has been applied to the top, and we also have the Mortise and Tenon connection applied to the fixed shelf where the end is finished. This added functionality in version 12 gives the user more control over the types of operations used within their assemblies, as each joint within the cabinet can have a specific connection applied to it. If you require any further assistance with setting up connections or applying them to your assemblies, don't hesitate to contact us at the help desk. Thank you for taking the time to watch our self-help video on the Connections Manager.